You can spend weeks chasing an answer and discover in the end that the answer is to stop asking that question. And you may be tempted to think of that as defeat, but I can assure you that it's not. It's actually a real cognitive event, an event that Lonergan calls inverse insight. It's a grasp that in a given frame, the point is precisely that there is no point to be had. And today, I want to make that event concrete and usable. We will pin down what an inverse insight is, how to recognize the moments that call for one, how to distinguish it from mere concrete confusion or laziness, and how to pivot clearly and cleanly when the right move is to deny unexpected intelligibility and reframe. So, first, a quick situating in our series. In the first episode, we made the act of understanding visible with the circle example, the image, the question, the insight, then the formulation and judgment. In episode 2, we saw how empirical method thinks on purpose through heuristic structures, naming the unknown, moving from correlations to functions, and verifying. In episode 3, we climbed to a higher viewpoint and watched rules, operations, and symbols reorganize the field. And today, we add a different kind of move. Not a higher one, but negative, a refusal that liberates. Now let me define it plainly. What is a direct insight? If you recall, a direct insight grasps a positive connection, the reason, the solution, the click. An inverse insight also arises within attentive inquiry, but it denies unexpected intelligibility. It catches that the question itself was misplaced, that the kind of answer you were reaching for is not there to be found. The denial itself runs counter to our spontaneous hope that every good question yields a constructive because. You feel its force when the best explanation is stop asking it like that. And Lonergan is actually very exact about its anatomy. There is first a positive object before you, some presented thing or imagined field you are generally working on. Second, there's a denial of a certain intelligibility you had expected to find in that object. Third, that the denial contradicts your natural anticipations. It goes against the grain of the question you brought to the data. In a demonstrative context, it can look like a proof that a certain type of question cannot be answered. In an empirical context, instead, it shows up as a successful theory that proceeds precisely by refusing to answer what seemed like an obligatory why. And this is subtle territory, so I think it makes sense that we ground it with classic instances. So, start with the irrationality of the square root of 2. You begin with a positive object, say a number, and with a perfectly reasonable expectation, saying something like, surely the square root of 2 is some fraction. Push that expectation and you hit a contradiction. You may ask, what's the upshot of this? We can hardly say that it's a new fraction, but actually, it is the negation that the square root of 2 has the rational form you anticipated. The insight here is inverse. The reason the square root of 2 is absurd is precisely that it's not what intelligence first expects it to be. And the point is that there is no such fraction. Shift the register to physics now. Consider uniform motion. The old habit is to demand the force to explain continued straight line motion. Newton's first law denies that expectation within mechanics. The explanatory move is to say the persistence of uniform motion is not to be explained by an additional push. And the scientific lesson is a refusal of a kind of explanation rather than a new push. Or we can take special relativity's basic postulate of invariance. Change your inertial frame, and the mathematical form of fundamental laws stays the same. What matters for us is the concrete meaning that, although the standpoint shifts, the relevant insight does not. Now, the denial here is of an anticipated difference in intelligibility that would mirror the difference in standpoint. You expect two standpoints, two different forms, and relativity says, no, not here. And that too is an inverse move woven into a larger positive framework. Now notice the pattern across these examples. An inverse insight is almost never naked. It lives inside a larger positive development, a proof technique, a mechanics, a relativistic framework. And those exploit the negative move to clear the field for what actually works. The inverse component is the decisive no, but it sits within a broader yes that you can teach, compute, and test with. But how do you tell when your situation calls for an inverse insight and not just more elbow grease, let's say? There are some reliable signs that are drawn from Lonergan's analysis and from practice. So first, your question presupposes a kind of intelligibility that never materializes no matter how you vary the image or the data. You keep adding detail, and the because you want just keeps evaporating. It continually recedes and evades your grasp. That friction can be diagnostic for sure, especially when your attempts increasingly feel like category mistakes, as if you're asking how many meters long is Wednesday. It doesn't make sense, right? You may be asking the wrong kind of why. We have a second sign. Your field exhibits structural residues that do not unify under one more classical law. You can secure local schemes of recurrence, but as you move to the concrete, additional determinations proliferate in a way that resists systematic integration under a single function. The intelligent response is not to pretend a master function exists, no, but to accept a different generality, ideal frequencies. And that acceptance is an inverse insight at the heart of the statistical method. And then we have a third sign though. The experimental or observational practices of your field already treats a swath of differences as random. Differences that, if they mattered systematically, would trigger a fresh hunt. The very don't chase that is a lived inverse conviction. Inquiry is warranted only when the average itself shifts. If difference oscillates about a single norm, digging for an extra mechanism is simply misframed. So let's try to put that point a little bit more philosophically. In the concrete, classical laws are abstract. Applying them always requires added determinations pulled from the situation. Those further determinations, are not themselves systematized by deeper classical law. But what then carries generality from the one more law is not there? Probability does. The non-systematic cannot diverge from an ideal frequency in any systematic way. This is the inverse pulse within the canon of statistical residues. And all of this calls for intellectual virtues. An inverse insight is not cynicism or capitulation, and don't think of it like that. One may have the propensity to think this. It's not hard to see why, but it's actually disciplined honesty about what sort of intelligibility is actually available. It's a refusal to answer an ill-posed question so that a well-posed one can emerge. Now, let's move from theory to craft. How do you work with inverse insights in your research or in the classroom, like myself, or more broadly in leadership positions? So first, learn to test the presupposition behind the question. Write the question as a template, such as, what mechanism M explains difference D? Then ask, do we have indexed evidence that D is non-random across the relevant ranges? And if not, your first intelligent move may be to model ideal frequencies, not to search for M directly. you're not giving up on explanation. What you're actually doing is changing the kind of intelligibility that you're looking for. The second is cultivate stop rules. In the lab and analytics context, pre-commit to criteria that tell you when to stop hunting a systematic cause and instead characterize a distribution. Place those rules in your pre-analysis plan. Thresholds for signal-to-noise stability of estimates across resamples, failure of additional variables to reduce residual variance in non-capricious ways. The stop rule operationalizes the inverse insight. If condition C holds, do not ask for one more mechanism. Pivot to frequencies. Third, teach by contrast. Present a case where a function genuinely governs the data and a parallel case where adding more terms only fits noise. Let students feel the different clicks. In the second case, the satisfying move is the inverse one. The reason is that there is no single reason of the kind we expected. Then show how a statistical law, an ideal frequency, carries disciplined generality without pretending to be a hidden function. And then fourth, we have a good reason to guard language. The easiest way to erase an inverse insight is to smuggle in occult causes, vague propensities, forces, or essences to cushion our discomfort. Science learned to say no to that habit because such appeals are not verifiable. So keep your affirmations within what your method can actually test and let parsimony do its quiet work. And then fifth, document your reframing when you deny an expected intelligibility. Write down the denied expectation, the evidence that forced the denial, and the positive frame you're adopting in its place. And that record that you write down protects you from two caricatures of inverse insight. The first is lazy skepticism, nothing is explainable, and naive persistence. That would be, if I just worked harder, the old questions will pay out, right? So let's try to make this still more concrete with three short vignettes. So the first vignette, we use a social behavior data set that shows weekly oscillations around the seasonal average. You can always add another covariate to explain tiny week-to-week differences, but your holdout error does not stabilize, and the extra variables do not travel across contexts. Here, the right move is inverse. Stop forcing a classical mechanism. Characterize the ideal frequency, its credible bounds, and the conditions under which the average itself shifts. That's one vignette. Here's another one. A biomed model fits beautifully in one lab, but collapses in multi-site replication. Deep dives reveal that side effects are real, numerous, and not compressible into a single hidden factor. The intelligibility you can responsibly affirm is a family of local schemes plus a statistical description of their dispersion. Generality is carried by frequency statements. Mechanistic unification is the wrong kind of why here. If that's not clear, here's a third vignette. A student keeps asking for the real cause of momentum conservation. The better answer is not one more push hiding behind the algebra. It's Newton's inverse move. Uniform motion needs no additional force to continue. That no is the positive insight clearing away a demand for explanation where none belongs. And I think that it's worth highlighting a pedagogical danger that Lonergan warns about. Because we communicate in concepts and sentences, it's easy to miss the move of understanding that lies behind the conceptual scene. And that is doubly true here, because the insight you must have is that there is no such insight of the expected kind to be had. If you only memorize the words inverse insight, you're obviously going to miss its felt corrective power in live inquiry. So you need to train yourself and your students to notice the moment when the pressure to systematize is out of step with the field you're actually in. Now, let me connect today's themes to episode 2's in a way that's complementary. Classical and statistical investigations aren't rival tribes, even though they may seem like that. They're actually different ways intelligence meets the world. Classical laws are abstract. Their application to concrete always requires further determinations. As those determinations proliferate non-systematically, there's no overarching classical law to unifying. That is where the inverse insight grounds a different generality, ideal frequency. You keep generality without pretending to a form that's simply not there. And turn the coin over. The statistical can ever clear the way for new classical advances in a transposed sense by separating non-systematic noise so that genuine systems can be seen. And properly understood, inverse insights don't choke discovery. What they actually do is they prune it. They stop you from wandering into the weeds. So I know that's a lot, and I think before we close, a compact checklist is needed so that you can use this week. So the first is, write your core question and underline its presupposed kind of intelligibility. If it presumes a single function, say so. If it presumes an ideal frequency, say so also. The second is, stress test the presupposition. What evidence would count in principle against the kind of intelligibility here? So that means now you move to a pre-commitment. Pre-commit stop rules for mechanistic hunting and criteria for pivoting to statistical characterization. When you pivot, make the inverse move explicit. Name the denied expectation and the positive alternative that you will now pursue in its place. Teach by parallel cases, one classical, one statistical, to build the feel for when the no point move actually liberates you. So let me end where we began. Inverse insight is an act of understanding that refuses an expected because, and by doing so, it removes an obstacle to real progress. It's a way intelligence stays honest about the world it meets. Learn to feel that moment, to formulate it clearly, to build your next move on top of it. And in our next episode, we'll press deeper into how to live with these two modes together, how judgments of fact and value stay reasonable when one part of your field is unified by laws and another by frequencies. But for now, if you found this helpful and that it helped sharpen your eye for the no point moment, I ask you to subscribe, turn on the notifications bell so you don't miss what comes next.